At exactly 4:30 in the morning, the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door clicked open loudly. In the pitch-black hallway, the massive Maine Coon cat named Barnaby stood fully stretched on his hind legs, his front paws pressing down hard on the door handle. With a sharp push, the heavy oak door swung open, letting a blast of freezing Chicago winter wind swirl into the silent house. Barnaby did not run outside into the snow. Instead, he turned around, clamped his sharp teeth onto the edge of a thick wool blanket resting on the armchair, and began to drag it. He pulled the heavy fabric inch by inch across the hardwood floor, straining his body until he reached the open threshold. He dropped the blanket directly onto the snow-covered porch, stepped out, and sat firmly beside it. Then, looking out into the dark, empty street, he began to cry. It was not a normal meow. It was a deep, guttural wail of desperate pleading. And the most terrifying part for the man watching silently from the top of the stairs was that this was the 14th night in a row the cat had prepared a bed for someone who never arrived. Arthur stood frozen on the landing, wrapping his robe tighter around his shoulders to block the sudden cold. He was a 62-year-old retired paramedic who had spent his entire career saving lives, but now spent his days entirely alone. Since his wife passed away 2 years ago, his large suburban house had felt like a silent, empty museum. He had adopted Barnaby 3 months ago from a local animal shelter just to hear the sound of breathing in the house other than his own. The shelter staff had warned Arthur that the giant, gray and black cat was a returned adoption. They labeled him as difficult and obsessed with escaping. But during the daylight hours, Barnaby was a gentle giant. He slept quietly on the living room rug, ate his food slowly, and rested his heavy head on Arthur's knee while they watched evening television. It was only when the clock ticked toward 4:30 in the morning that the cat transformed into a frantic, determined creature with a mission Arthur could not comprehend. The strange behavior escalated with every passing night. At first, Arthur thought it was an accident. He assumed Barnaby had simply stretched against the doorframe and bumped the lock. But on the 5th night, Arthur hid in the hallway shadows and watched the cat deliberately manipulate the deadbolt with intense focus. By the 10th night, Barnaby was not just dragging one blanket. He pulled a heavy sofa cushion off the couch, pushing it slowly toward the front door. He was building something out there. A nest, a bed, and he was building it directly in the freezing wind. On the 12th night, Arthur tried to intervene. He walked downstairs, picked up the frozen blanket, and closed the door firmly. Barnaby immediately let out a loud, agonized hiss. The cat threw his heavy body against the solid oak door, scratching the wood frantically until his claws chipped. Arthur had to physically carry the struggling cat upstairs, where Barnaby paced the bedroom floor until dawn, crying without pause. Arthur stopped sleeping completely. He sat in his armchair night after night, drinking black coffee, his heart racing as he watched the wall clock edge toward 4:30. The sheer consistency of the act was chilling. It was not a random animal instinct. It was a strict, unbreakable schedule. Arthur tried to apply logic to the terrifying situation. He was a medical man. He believed in symptoms and clear diagnoses. His first thought was that Barnaby was reacting to the scent of a female cat wandering the neighborhood. Arthur scrubbed the porch with heavy enzymes and sprayed chemical deterrents. It did not change a single thing. Then he wondered if Barnaby was traumatized by the tight spaces of the shelter and simply felt claustrophobic in the dark house. Arthur left every light on and kept the interior doors wide open. Barnaby still went straight to the front door at the exact same minute. Arthur even called his former colleague, a veterinarian, who suggested the cat might be hearing mice moving in the walls near the entrance. Arthur tore away a section of drywall by the door, finding nothing but old yellow insulation. The harder Arthur tried to solve the puzzle, the more confusing it became. Every logical effort failed completely. On the 16th night, Arthur decided he had endured enough. He drove to the hardware store and purchased a heavy-duty chain lock. He installed it high at the top of the door frame, far out of any cat's reach. That night, when Barnaby realized he could not open the door, he did something that made Arthur's blood run cold. The cat abandoned the door, walked to the living room window, and began slamming his own head against the freezing glass. Before we continue with this shocking mystery, if you love heartwarming and mysterious stories like this, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It gives me the motivation to keep bringing you incredible stories. Arthur rushed forward and grabbed Barnaby, wrapping the trembling cat tightly in a thick towel to stop him from hurting himself. The cat was breathing heavily, his green eyes wide with absolute panic, staring through the glass into the snowy street. Arthur looked out the window over the cat's head. There was nothing there, just the orange glow of the street lamp reflecting off the fresh snow. The next morning, Arthur knew he could not guess any more. He needed absolute facts. He drove straight to the animal shelter where he had adopted the cat and asked to speak directly to the director. "I need the complete history on this cat," Arthur said, leaning heavily over the front desk. "Not the summary. Everything you have in his file." The director hesitated, pulling up the digital record on her screen. "We do not usually disclose previous owner details, Arthur." "He is hurting himself," Arthur pleaded, his voice cracking. "He is trying to build a bed on my freezing porch at exactly 4:30 every morning. I need to know why he is doing this." The director's eyes widened slightly in surprise. She turned the computer monitor toward him. "Barnaby was not a street stray," she explained softly. "He was surrendered 6 months ago. His previous owner was an 80-year-old woman named Clara Higgins. She lived about 3 miles away from your current house." "Why did she surrender him?" Arthur asked urgently. "She did not want to," the director replied. "She was moved into a locked assisted living facility. Her family brought the cat here to us. Clara suffered from severe Alzheimer's disease." Arthur stared at the glowing screen. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, but they still did not fit together. Barnaby was traumatized by losing his owner. That made emotional sense. But why the door? Why the heavy blankets? Why the exact same time every single morning? Did Clara live alone before she was moved to the facility? Arthur asked. "Yes, for a few years," the director said, reading the typed notes. "Her family finally stepped in because she started wandering away from the house. The police found her outside in the middle of winter multiple times. She would get confused, unlock her front door, and just walk out into the deep snow wearing nothing but her nightgown." A heavy silence fell over the small office room. Arthur felt a cold chill spread rapidly through his chest. Barnaby was not trying to escape the house. Barnaby was repeating a learned pattern. For years he had lived with a sick woman who wandered into the freezing cold. But that still did not explain why the cat was trying to build a bed on Arthur's porch. If he was just repeating a bad habit, he would just open the door and look out. Dragging the blankets meant something else entirely. Arthur drove home in a complete daze. He sat in his car in the driveway, looking at his silent house. He looked at the living room window where Barnaby had slammed his head, and then the memory of his long years as a paramedic hit him like a heavy freight train. He remembered the emergency calls, the elderly patients who wandered away from home in the middle of the night. He remembered how mental disorientation often followed a strict, terrifying internal clock. Patients would wake up at the exact same hour every night, deeply convinced they needed to go to work or catch a train that had stopped running decades ago. Arthur rushed inside the house. He looked at Barnaby, who was sleeping exhausted beside the warm radiator. Clara used to wander at exactly 4:30 in the morning. Barnaby could not stop her from turning the lock. He was just a cat. He could not physically pull an 80-year-old woman back inside when her broken mind forced her out into the deadly winter weather. Arthur's hands began to shake violently as the devastating truth crashed over him. When Clara collapsed in the snow, freezing and deeply confused, her cat had done the only thing he could physically do. He had dragged the heavy blankets from the couch out to the porch to keep her warm. He had built a nest around her freezing body and cried into the dark night until a neighbor or a passing police car heard him. Barnaby was not a crazy, difficult animal. He was a survivor carrying a massive burden of love. He had spent years keeping his sick mother alive in the snow, and now, living in a new house with a new owner, his deep trauma convinced him that someone he loved was still out there, freezing in the dark, desperately waiting for a blanket. Arthur dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor, pulled the giant cat tightly into his arms, and wept loudly. Arthur knew he could not simply lock the door and force Barnaby to forget his past. You cannot cure true love with a heavy metal chain lock. The cat needed emotional closure. He needed to finally know his painful job was done. That afternoon, Arthur made a series of urgent phone calls. It took hours of arguing with privacy regulations and facility managers, but his professional background as a paramedic eventually opened the right doors. He located the exact memory care facility where Clara Higgins was currently living. The next morning at 4:15, Arthur did not lock the front door. Instead, he put on his heavy winter coat. When Barnaby went to the deadbolt, Arthur opened it for him. He helped the cat carry the thick wool blanket out to the snowy porch. They sat together in the freezing cold for 10 minutes. "She is not out here, buddy," Arthur whispered, stroking the cat's thick gray fur. "But I'm going to take you to her right now." At 9 in the morning, Arthur loaded Barnaby into the travel carrier and drove across town to the Silver Pines Care Center. The facility staff led Arthur down a quiet, sunlit hallway. Clara sat in a padded wheelchair by a large window, staring blankly at the snow falling outside. Her eyes were empty, completely lost in the thick fog of her illness. Arthur opened the plastic carrier door. Barnaby stepped out slowly. The giant cat walked across the polished linoleum floor and gently placed his large front paws on Clara's knees. He let out a soft, very familiar trill. Clara blinked slowly. Her hands, trembling and incredibly thin, slowly reached out and buried themselves deep in the thick gray fur. A profound, clear light suddenly broke through the dark fog in her eyes. "My sweet boy," she whispered, her fragile voice cracking with emotion. "You stayed warm." Barnaby purred, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the entire quiet room. He climbed carefully into her lap, rested his head on her arm, and closed his eyes. For an entire hour, Arthur sat in the corner chair, watching the beautiful reunion. The nursing staff watched from the doorway in silent tears. 3 weeks later, Arthur's lonely life had completely changed. He became a registered, active volunteer at the care facility. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, he brought Barnaby to visit Clara and the other elderly residents. The silent, empty museum of Arthur's house was entirely gone. It was replaced by a deep sense of purpose. Barnaby never touched the front door lock again. The internal clock of panic had finally stopped ticking inside his mind. He no longer needed to drag heavy blankets into the freezing wind, because he finally understood that the person he was trying to protect was completely safe, warm, and no longer lost in the dark. On a quiet winter night, Arthur sat in his armchair, a warm mug of tea resting in his hand. Barnaby was curled up tightly on his lap, sleeping a deep, peaceful sleep. Arthur rested his hand on the cat's chest, feeling the steady, calm heartbeat. They had both spent years of their lives trying to save people, carrying the heavy weight of duty alone. Now, they were finally allowing themselves to rest together. Sometimes, love is not found in grand romantic gestures. It is found in a heavy blanket dragged across a cold floor in the darkest hour of the night. It is the fierce, unbreakable promise to protect the ones we love, even when we do not fully understand the danger. Animals carry memories in their hearts just as deeply as we do, and their loyalty never checks the clock.